So as a new year or a new semester begins, we think of our classes again. Not that we don't think of our classes otherwise. So first, I thought I'll start talking with the notion of lesson planning. When people do training programs, and in some colleges, the authorities insist on having written lesson plans, which is all good. I have no particular things to say about that. But I would go a step beyond that and think of lesson planning as a part of our essential preparation for teaching. So however you plan, however good a teacher you are, and however excellent our students are, and however wonderful our facilities, there can be very good days and there can be very bad days. I do not mean rainy days or very hot days. I mean, you plan very well and you go to a class and you find that none of your tricks work on that particular day. And some days you don't plan that much and you are rather off your mood and all that, but still you find that your class has worked exceptionally well. This is an experience that every teacher has gone through. So that shows that we are different from other people working in the other fields. In another area, if you plan well, you know exactly how your trajectory is going to be, how exactly the things will go. But in a classroom, that's not the case, particularly because we are working with living, very dynamic human beings, and there is a different kind of combination in each class, and the dynamics of the class will vary according to that, many umpteen different aspects. So we can never really anticipate how our class is going to be, particularly in this context of autonomy. Maybe 30 years or 40 years back, it was okay. If you plan a lecture well, you go deliver your lecture and come back, it's fine. It's not the teacher's worry whether the students understood or they were listening, etc. We kind of had the teacher-centered model of classes then. But now, the last 1 decade, 2 decades, we have gone a long way to giving our learners autonomy. Largely, they have become autonomous now, but still we have quite a long way to go. So particularly with autonomous learners, with their needs and their priorities given a lot of importance, our class can never be anticipated. So planning a lesson, planning a class, by lesson I mean a session that you do 1 hour or 45 minutes. So planning a lesson will certainly increase the chances of it being a successful one, a general statement. And I quote Jim Scrivener, who is a writer I respect quite a lot. Here is a book by Scrivener that you might find useful. It's called Learning Teaching, Essential Guide to English Language Teaching. That is Jim Scrivener. Scrivener says planning is also a thinking skill, which made me think a lot. We always think of planning as something that we write down very tediously because somebody asked us to do that. But for a teacher on whom a formal lesson plan is not a compulsion, even planning becomes a thinking skill. It's part of our thinking process. When we plan our class, that is, when we think of our class, we start planning, and planning is part of the thinking process. Well, but the written plan, if you have, it shows that you have been thinking, and that's not always needed for a teacher. For an experienced teacher, or even an inexperienced teacher, that it is possible to have the plan in your head. You don't have to write it down in great detail. But it is good to have practice and writing lesson plans, and also in revising it, because that will update you in terms of the requirements of the learners and things like that. So having the plan in your head is very important. So this is by way of opening the conversation. Now I have for you a little paragraph which I'd like you to read quickly. It has a couple of statements that are not true. So I'd like you to keep in your mind which are not true. Here I am imagining you to be students. This is a task perhaps I would give to my students when I begin a class with a particular item in mind. So here, for example, I have a grammatical item in mind, and I am trying to present it to the class. So I request your attention to this slide where I have written a paragraph in which there are a couple of things that are not true. I'm lying there. Please read. Take 30 seconds for that. So this is my account about lockdown. So I've said that lockdown days are indeed special. I find these days just great and have attended a few parties. The police force is very vigilant and would not allow people to go out unnecessarily. The tigers in the city zoo have been roaming free to ensure peace. Most people remain indoors, reading books or fighting with family as usual. I shave every day and have even dyed my beard. So that is a paragraph with both facts and fibs in it. So this is something I have for you. And in the second stage, I have highlighted the sentences which are not true. I'm sure you guessed because it's very evident. I find these days just great and have attended a few parties. It's not possible. The tigers in the cities who have been roaming free to ensure peace. Well, I shave every day and have even dyed my beard. You look at my face and you know it's a lie. So these are three statements in the sentence which are not true, but it is it is contextual for us because it's related to the teacher who is talking. It is contextual to us because it is about a condition that all of us are going through. So in the third stage, I draw your attention just to three parts of the whole unit: have attended, have been roaming, and have even died. So I have zeroed in on three grammatical items which involve the present perfect form. Well, now let's go to the next slide, which is about how do students learn a new item. The new item I am trying to teach here is present perfect forms. Well, I'm not going to teach in detail at all. I'm just drawing your attention to a few aspects of teaching. So in our everyday class, don't read it. I don't want you to be distracted by the stuff on the PowerPoint. Just listen to me now. We as teachers, we teach literature. Many of us teach literature, but we have a big responsibility of teaching language to our learners, particularly learners in their beginning stage, the initial stage. Maybe throughout the undergrad period, they can be considered to be in the early part, and then slowly they will move to the higher levels of language learning. So we assume that we present in the class an item. It can be a grammar item. It can be a pronunciation item. It can be a vocabulary item. Here I have taken a grammar item, which we saw, which was the present perfect forms. But I am not telling you that it is a present perfect. I just shared that with you because we are teachers, and I wanted you to know that. But in the class, I wouldn't mention these are present perfect tenses until much later, if at all I would do that. Well, there are a few stages through which a learner learns a new item, or rather the teacher teaches a new item in the class. The first stage is ignorance or near ignorance. Forgive that expression, it sounds rather negative, but it just means that student is not aware of a particular item. It's not that he is living in darkness, in great ignorance. He is ignorant about a particular aspect, and it is that aspect that I am trying to focus on. So the progression is from that to 6, which we'll read one by one. Read along with me. Don't read ahead of me. There is no particular point. We are not in a competition here. The learner doesn't know anything about the item. So the item here, we know it is perfect forms. The second stage is exposure. The learner hears or reads examples of the item, maybe a number of times, but doesn't particularly notice it. We did that here. We read this form within a context. We are teachers. We are advanced. We have advanced knowledge in English, so we just looked at it for 30 seconds. But maybe we'll allow our learners to look at it more, allow them to read it a couple of times. So that is the first stage where we have this exposure to learning. And then the third is Noticing. The learner begins to realize that there is a feature he doesn't fully understand, not always, or a feature that he needs to know more about. So let me add that to that statement. A learner realizes there's a feature he needs to know more about. Okay, so that is where this noticing happens. Okay, so that is what happened in the second stage, that there is something problematic about these sentences. They are untrue. That is why only the fibs statements, the untrue statements, have these features. So that is to draw their attention to that. Slight planning on the part of the teacher, where they notice that there is a feature in these sentences which are not there. And this is not a conscious process, let me tell you. So you don't have to tell them to notice anything at all. Teacher do not have to tell them to notice. This exposure, noticing are things that should happen automatically. And how you create that in the class depends on your ingenuity and your skill as a teacher. And the third stage is understanding, where the learner starts to look more closely at the item and tries to work out the formation rules and the meanings, possibly with the help of reference information, explanation, and other help. Here it's a bit conscious process where you encourage them to look at that particular item. So it's a vocabulary item, it's a pronunciation item, or like here, or a grammar item. We allow them to focus more on those particular places where the item that we want them to learn is hidden. So that is where the understanding happens. I'm just referring to these things in a very general way. We need to work differently with different grammatical items in different classes. Well, in the fifth stage, the learner tries to use the item in his own speech or writing. Yeah. Maybe hesitatingly or with errors. But in the fifth stage, how it should be done can be done by teachers in so many different ways, where you encourage the learner to go out beyond the context. Yeah. So in the fifth stage, what we do is we travel further. For example, in this case, you can ask the students to create 4 sentences of their own, following the teacher's model, about their own lives, which should have the same structure. Alternate sentences should contain the same construction and should contain a mistake or something like that, which will give them practice. And it is the sixth stage, which is something that happens outside the classroom, where the learner integrates the item fully into his or her language and uses it without being conscious about it. Yeah. But still there will be minor errors. That's a very important thing you should keep in mind. From the very beginning till the end, there is our movement is not always towards perfection. There will be errors in all stages, but our aim is to make that item useful for the person who is learning it. It should not remain in a domain separately, something that happens exclusively in the classroom. It should become the learner's own, so that he or she goes out and tries it out. So, well, I'm not giving any solutions. This is generally the progression of how a class will progress, and this is how we implement it depends on our individual ways of teaching. And I would also say this is the process through which we learn even outside the classroom. Well, on a broader scale, where we talk about the extensive reading and extensive listening, through reading books, through reading articles, through reading stories, or listening to stories, listening to music, etc., the students are being exposed. And this noticing, in this class, this is a class environment where we structured them, structured the lesson in such a way that there is a case of noticing. But in actual life, we are not conscious about it. As the student is exposed to the language naturally through reading and listening, this noticing happens automatically, provided you give the orientation in the... I was talking about natural acquisition of language. Students can do without teachers. In learning language, students can manage without teachers. But I'm not saying that we are redundant, but the learning becomes much more enriching. We give them this structured practice of doing this, not consciously. You're not going to tell them that, well, you're ignorant of this item and I'm going to expose you to it first and then you will notice. This is something the teacher keeps in the mind. This is entirely for the teacher to have in mind and structure the lesson plan accordingly, or the lesson accordingly. And we need to keep in mind that this is a process the student will also follow in real life when he or she tries to learn language through being exposed to wide reading and wide listening. So they get exposed to so many structures, and at times they notice some particular structure or particular idiom or particular spelling. And while if it's listening, they will notice a particular accent or a pronunciation aspect. Noticing happens. If you can give them in this training in the class, they will do it better in real life. And then this understanding of the meaning, etc., happens. And the practice and active use part outside there, which we hope will happen in their real life, if provided they have the context, they will also come back to the class and have it, give expression to it while we give them some tasks to do. Well, this is the general plan we should have when our focus is on language learning. And when we are teaching literature, we can also have this very same things in mind, so that we extract both literary aspects and linguistic aspects from the text we are dealing. All right. Here, I think the second aspect I'll talk about. The first aspect was on lesson planning. Second aspect is about teaching grammar, because we do a lot of grammar teaching. And the point of what grammar teaching is all about is a very troubling question. I would say, everything we do in the class is grammar related. So we need to remember that grammar is not just what is contained in a grammar book. Grammar is everything that we do in the class. Even pronouncing a sentence, giving the proper accent in a particular place is partly grammatical. So it's not just the structure. You say the right structure in the wrong way, you get your idea wrong. So that is this. So the grammar, I would mean in a very wide way, everything that helps your learner understand what you're saying, everything the learner need to communicate with his or her peers and out in the job environment, everything he needs related to language would be grammatical needs. But we use grammar in this restricted way, in the sense of how the words are arranged, the structure, the syntax of the sentences, the structural things, what we usually categorize under grammar. So we have these three aspects of grammar which we need to keep in mind. The form, which is the present perfect, for example. We discussed that. The form, the way in which the words appear to our eyes before the cognition happens. And there is a meaning, of course, certainly. What meaning we get is also a very important thing. But we generally neglect this aspect. Mostly in the traditional classes and even in today's classes, because we are inundated by so many other responsibilities and so many other work priorities, we often focus more on form and meaning. We say this is a form and this is what it means, is what we also do. We assume that the learner acquires the use or function. The learner learns how to use it in context and learns the function of it later on their own. That is our assumption. We do this form and meaning in the class and assume that this big chunk happens in the lives of the students, which need not always happen. So then how do we structure our class, grammar class? This POP is a fond word I'm using to refer to my father, who passed away last November. He was a teacher. He lived a rich life as a teacher. And he would share with me this experience of teaching grammar when he was primarily an economics teacher. But when he was a young person, he used to teach some people in the neighborhood how to use English, because he had an interest in English. So he would share this experience of presenting the form noun plus is plus verb plus ing. This is a present continuous form, and he would first say this is how so what he would do is he would say, I'm going to teach you the present continuous form today. Students, dear students, today we are doing the present continuous form in English. And then he would give examples. My sister is singing, Gopal's son is walking, and so many examples he would give. And he would give people exercise after that. And one exercise he gave was Rama's wife is dash. He expected them to say Rama's wife is walking, Rama's wife is singing, Rama's wife is cooking, etc. But the answer one of the students wrote was Rama's wife is seething. So she knew Rama's wife was Sita, and because after his ing should come, so noun plus is plus verb plus ing. So she created this little nice verb and put an ing after that. Well, that was the result of this model of teaching. Well, of course, this method of teaching worked with so many people, but there were occasions when it failed, and this is an occasion when it did not work, a proverbial occasion. So what he was trying to do is, he presented the form first, and he gave some practice to the students, and he hoped that the students will use it in the class. This is what traditionally we have been doing. We would present the form, we would give them practice in the class, and then we'll assume that it has become theirs, that they will use it, which very often did not happen. This still continues to be a problem in our classes. When we present, we give them practice, but we assume that this use part, using that construction or that particular language feature in real life, we hope will happen on its own sometime later. But very often it doesn't happen. Now imagine you are teaching a grammar item, and your thought should be, after the students leave the class, will they be able to recognize it when they meet it, means the grammar item, while listening or reading? Will they be able to form the item in isolation, including stress, intonation, etc.? Will they be able to use it to express some meanings? In short, has that grammar item become their own? This is a question we need to ask ourselves when we plan a language class, and particularly a grammar class. So this is the old model, which ended in Rama's wife is seething, which is the presentation, practice, and the assumed use. And this is a different model where what we did before. You read a passage first. You used your linguistic knowledge first. And then you had a practice of it. Or rather, you did not have, but the student later on did a practice where they wrote their own sentences. And later at the end, in another day, if you want, the teacher can tell them what we did in the last class was to learn the present perfect form. So this is just the opposite of the old model. The problem is, when you tell them you are going to do the present perfect tense in the very beginning of the class, my experience is, and the experience of most teachers will be, that students will be slightly frightened by these terms. And even very intelligent students who are capable of designing a rocket will complain that English is difficult. It's proverbially so, primarily because we have always told them these difficult terminology. Terms like present perfect continuous, etc., are meant for teachers to keep in their minds and encourage the learners to make it their own. The learner should be able to use a present perfect construction, but he need not necessarily know it is a present perfect construction. Only those students who later on plan to become English teachers on their own need to have that knowledge. But sometimes the expressions like present or past or tense, etc., will be very useful in the class, but that can happen a little later in our class. So this is something we need to deal in great detail, but just briefly I am touching on that aspect. And third thing we discussed today would be the use of language one in the class. So how much mother tongue would we use in the class? How much Tamil can be used, or how much Hindi can be used, or Malayalam, Kannada can be used in the class when we are teaching English to the students? There can be two extremes. There can be too much of language one and too little of language one. So what happens when there is too much of mother tongue? I've written here that human nature is not to do anything that is not necessary. None of us would do anything, use our brain or use our muscles, unless we have full conviction why we should do that. So you read an English sentence to the students, and then you explain the whole thing in your mother tongue. What happens is the students will listen. Most of the students will listen only to the translated part. Their brain will switch. It'll go into a hibernation mode when you're reading the English, and they will become alert when you read the mother tongue part. That is because we are structured like that. We won't do anything unless there is a need for it. So, but this is not about all the students in the class, but a good number of students in the class. This is a challenge that we always have. So the question is, how much can we use mother tongue in the class? Very serious question. There need to be a balance. That's the idea. Not too much of language one and not too little of language one. If you totally take language one out of the class also, we can have a problem. Let's look at this. Language one use, mother tongue use is to be judiciously done. We generally tolerate language one use. So when the teacher is teaching, and the teacher's idea is that, the teacher has decided not to use mother tongue in the class, or minimally use mother tongue in the class, and the teacher is using only English consistently. But then she or he finds a lot of students using mother tongue. We will generally tolerate that. We won't impose English on them at that stage. But yeah, even the teacher can use the mother tongue when it is needed, because another important thing is we are working with, as I said, brains which has a strong emotional part. Human beings are very emotive, and very often we assume that they are only highly rational creatures. That's not so. I was saying that even the teacher can resort to language one, mother tongue, because as I was saying, our students are have a strong emotional aspect to them, and sometimes using a little bit of mother tongue in the class will work magic. They will feel motivated, or they'll feel more connection with the teacher. This is something I have felt very often, even while doing PG classes. When we continuously go on in English, there is a disconnect between the teacher and the students at times, which needs to be resolved. Anyway, so but even though we tolerate mother tongue in the class, in every class we can have maybe 5 or 10 minutes a program, some activity we do. Yes. So we'll go to the next aspect, which is related to correcting errors. Well, a major issue that we have in the class. A couple of points we need to remember is errors are not always bad. We have a strong animosity towards errors, and we also do not like if our errors are corrected. So we must remember that 2 things. One is errors are not always bad. They are positive signs of growth. It shows that the person is trying to learn. A child who's very small will try to stand up and walk, and then it will inevitably fall. Nobody just jumps up, springs up one fine morning and walks straight out of the room. You fall, you crawl, you are in all kinds of miserable states before you actually start walking firmly on the ground. In the same way, when we learn language, we do make an immense lot of errors, which is a positive sign that you are doing it. A child that is lying down all the time, it's not positive. Many parents have this worry. They say, why is my child always falling down? It's falling down because it's a normal, healthy baby. In the same way, our students make mistakes because they are normal, healthy individuals, and because they are trying to learn. So one point is that errors are not always bad. Of course, making errors persistently is certainly problematic. I'm not talking about that. Having difficulties in your language is an inevitable process of language development. It's applicable to us too. And all errors need not be corrected all the time. That's another aspect. We have as teachers, we feel that the students should come up only with the correct sentences. If they make a mistake, you are terribly alarmed. You don't have to be alarmed. Let them make mistakes. All errors need not be corrected all the time. If you do an activity in the class and the student speaks and he makes a mistake and he tries to correct, you try to correct him, it'll impede his fluency. It'll inhibit him. He won't feel like speaking spontaneously the next time. So all errors need not be corrected all the time, because correction should not be at the cost of fluency and self-esteem. 2 important things. A student tries to speak and he speaks in a clumsy language. You just allow him to speak. And you just have this culture in the class where the others also learn to respect this learning process, where you make mistakes in all aspects, in pronunciation, in spelling, etc. And you don't correct all the time. And correcting is a major thing. When you correct, when you scold, when you give impositions, etc., you are challenging the self-esteem of the learner. I'm not talking about persistent arbitrary mistakes. I'm talking about natural errors that happen in the class, which we frown upon generally. Correction should not be at the cost of fluency, and it should not impede the self-esteem of the learner. And the teacher can effect correction in the class without personalizing. So when a person is talking, you keep quiet, and you note that error, and you later, through a little activity or through in a statement that, well, let me look at this particular aspect. I've often heard people do it this way, etc. Without pinpointing the person, you can make these corrections. What I meant by personal correction is, if there is a student in the class who persistently make a mistake, you can talk to him or her personally and discuss the issue with him. That is also a possibility of that. Then he won't feel challenged. When you correct before the peers, very often they feel humiliated. Well, and at the end of every class, you can have a discussion of the most persistent errors. That's a way of correcting mistakes. So very often we feel that, oh, there's this ocean of errors in the class, and what am I going to do about it? You cannot do anything about it. It's not the teacher's business to correct all the mistakes that the students are ever going to make. You may be able to support them with a few. So at the end of your well-planned class, spare 10 minutes, perhaps, if possible, to discuss one or two issues that you notice. It can be related to pronunciation. It can be related to grammar. Discuss one or two issues and give them some work based on that. That's the way you move slowly from fluency to accuracy. Another aspect, we are coming towards the final part. Learning styles and learner differences is one thing we need to keep in mind. As I said, our classrooms are very dynamic. They keep changing because we have autonomous learners. And when we move towards autonomy of learners, we need to consider learning styles and learner differences very seriously. Each student has can have a different learning style from the teacher's style and from the style of the others. It's the learning style and is closely related to the personality of the learners. Each learner is unique, and each learner is different in the way he or she perceives and constructs the world. We have a different way in which we understand the world, and in the same way, we have a different way in which we learn also. I learn about the world by seeing, and I am a visual learner. I am more able to listen to the sounds of my surroundings and understand. I am more, my auditory system is stronger. You have different ways in which you learn, and your learners also will be different in that way. And you need to structure your class accordingly. So depending on the individual styles of understanding, we need to structure our class. Teaching strategies should be framed to suit this variety among the learning styles. Well, this is again another topic. What I'm doing today is kind of discuss different or those aspects which I thought are very important when you start your classes afresh. And here is a little checklist for teachers who are planning to do a language class. There are different kinds of intelligences, as we often have heard, and this is a checklist. When you plan a lesson, whether it's a written plan or a plan that you have in your mind, see that you have addressed linguistically intelligent students by including reading, speaking, writing, spelling activities and games in your class. Games do not mean students running about all the time. It can be a 5-minute puzzle solving or a jigsaw or a crossword doing or something like that. It is optional. You don't have to have games in the class. You can, it's good, but you need not always have it. Just like students are of different nature, we are also of different nature. Every teacher cannot be a performer. Every teacher cannot be dynamic, springing around and all that. So according to but we can always move to away from our pattern and change a bit. But at the same time, sometimes you may not have the skill to conduct a game in the class, don't do it. It's not necessary. If you can, certainly have games in the class. Well, and many of our learners are highly logical in their learning. They like things to be to have a pattern, to be in the form of tables, in well structured formula form, etc. So you need to keep them in mind. Have you included grammar practice, problem solving tasks, logic puzzles, calculations, critical thinking activities? Don't worry about these things, but I just want to draw your attention towards that. And there are very visual learners who would include, who would like colors, who would like graphics, images. So you need to include visuals, colors, pictures, etc. for them. And bodily kinesthetic, as I was saying, some teachers are very bodily kinesthetic. They can dance and they can move around the class dynamically, but everybody cannot do that. And so just as there are different kind of learners, there are different kind of teachers. But we can learn a bit from our colleagues. Very often you feel that a particular colleague is doing things differently. Don't worry about it. That is, he or she has a special kind of intelligence, and yours is different. You have your own strengths, but at the same time, you can pick some cues from the other persons and try to do that a bit. Develop your skill in doing something else. Bodily kinesthetic learners who like to have action in the class. So role plays and stuff like that will help them a lot. Role plays and group activity should become part of our class, which I think already has become anyway. I leave this musical part. These two are very important, intrapersonal and interpersonal things. Some students are highly introverted and they work best when they are alone. So give them, see that you have some work for them, private learning time, self-relaxation, learning diaries. There will be a handful of students who are highly introverted in the class, who always tend to suffer in the class because you feel that they are too arrogant or too proud. But actually, that need not be the case. It's just that the person is a bit shy deep within, very lonely kind of individual who has great potential in him or her, who would need special attention. You don't mock them in the class, but give special care to them, additional duties, etc. And there are many with high interpersonal skill who can, interact with others, who are not at all shy, who are very communicative, etc. So you need to keep them also in mind. So your class will have all these kinds of things, and your lesson plan need to have all these things in mind too. Well, I think that is pretty much that I have to discuss with you. Before I conclude and request questions, I conclude saying it's important to bear in mind that there are many different ways of learning, and there are many different ways of teaching, and that many would resist any attempt to change their preferred learning style. Students wouldn't want to change their learning style. A style that they have formed in school, they may live it through their life. So you need to respect that. And we also have the same problem. We may have a learning style which we may try to impose on our students, which again is a very dangerous thing because your student is not you. And we need to keep that in mind very much. The whole area of learner difference is rather complex and can be quite perplexing even to experienced learners. So this is only a tip of the iceberg. The problems that teachers confront every day in the classroom is of a wide range, and it's very complex, including the aspects related to learner difference. We need to be well informed about the strengths and limitations of the models we are using and adapt them judiciously. Models of lessons in the classroom. When you plan your lesson, keep all these things in mind. We too constantly learn. At no point will a teacher be able to say, I have learned everything, now I can easily do a lesson. That will never come. Even however old you get, the students are also changing, the times are changing, and you need to shift your ways accordingly. So this is the whole process. Here you have input, which is what we give the learners in the class, and also what we expect the learners to do outside the classroom through extensive reading and listening. And learning is something that we assume will happen in between, through understanding, through memorizing, reflection, noticing, etc. And finally, you have the use part. This is the largely under, the part that we don't give much attention to. We need to focus on this a lot, because unless we do that, our input and this central part will have little impact. That is basically what this image is trying to tell you. So what we do in the class is two kinds of exposure. One is restricted exposure. Just like I gave a passage in the beginning, that is restricted exposure. It can be for reading or listening. And this authentic exposure is what the students actually read outside the classroom, which is, we can also do that. You're giving them newspaper articles to read, would be authentic exposure. The language that they will encounter in real life is authentic exposure. Restricted exposure is the language models that we create for them in the form of a textbook or the teacher developed content. And there is also other data, postbook information, teacher explanations, doubts that we get cleared, reference books, etc. And all these things help in noticing. If noticing doesn't happen, the language learning process will not be very rewarding. Very often we have a problem with this because we are worried more about structuring our lesson. We are worried about the input aspect. Sometimes we are not sure whether the students do this noticing. Only if they notice will they be able to use it. And this is about output. We expect them to notice and then to use what I was repeatedly talking about, the U aspect, which is using, where the students use. And using also can have a restricted mode and an authentic mode. In the restricted mode is what we do in the classroom, where you ask a person to stand up and speak or to discuss in group or to submit a written assignment is the restricted output, where they will use a limited number of vocabulary items. They don't have much choice in doing it. In the authentic output, they have a lot of choice to experiment and to use a wider range of skills that they have learned. So this is actually a summing up of what I have put in the presentation throughout. Thank you.